Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David. Whoop, bip, bip, bip. Are we playing this? Okay. Okay, I always forget about the opening there. Sorry about that, Robert. Sorry about that, everybody out there. This is Robert Bryce, the great Robert Bryce has joined me, one of the finest energy analysts and writers working today. Guy who goes all over the country doing public presentations, keynote speaker, and has his own Substack, Robert Bryce at Substack or dot Substack. That is a must read every day if you want to know what's happening in the energy space. Robert, how are you today?
Excellent. Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great for you to come on again. I really appreciate it. We got a lot to talk about today.
There is a lot going on.
Yeah, last week you published such a great story on your Substack last week about the new EPA regulations in the power generation sector, and talking about how these regulations risk killing AI in the cradle because they're going to be so restrictive, not just on coal-fired power plant, but natural gas power plants. Talk about what you were thinking about in that article.
Sure. Well, I mean, the preface here is May 9th, the EPA published in the Federal Register their final rule on greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And it is remarkable, one, in its complexity, and second, in the reach and potential impact on the overall U.S. economy that this rule could have if it is allowed to stand. Now, before going on, this rule has been challenged already. In fact, the very same day on May 9th, I think it was 27 states and the NRECA, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, filed suit for asking for a stay. Since then, the American Public Power Association and the numerous investor-owned utilities have filed suit. I was just came back from Savannah, Georgia, where I spoke to the Tennessee Valley Public Power Association. They are going to file as well. So there is a broad coalition of groups now, including Edison Electric Institute, as I understand it, the investor-owned utilities as a whole, are filing to block this. And why are they doing so? Well, if this rule is allowed to stand, it just devastates the electric grid in America. It will force immediately, effectively, the closure of all the coal plants in America. Now, I say immediately, by 2032. Yeah. Well, but the problem is that it creates so much uncertainty. And the reason that the rule says that unless these coal plants add carbon capture and sequestration to their plants, they have to shut down. Well, utilities can't risk this in the future. They invest decades into the future. So, we'll just shut down coal. Okay, well, that's easy to say, but I put together the numbers. Today, even though coal in America is declining, it's still 16% of all the electricity generated in America.
That's more than wind and solar combined, right?
I know, and that was the part that even surprised me. And I'm a numbers guy. I pride myself on doing my research and trying to figure out, okay, well, what's really going on? The amount of coal-fired generation in America is more than what's produced by solar and wind combined. And so this rule is really ruinous. And I pegged it on AI, on artificial intelligence, because everyone's talking about that now. But the reality is that unless new baseload gas plants have CCS, that they build them with CCS, you can't build new baseload gas plants. So it's just an incredibly short-sighted rule, and one that I think, unfortunately, and I say this as a nonpartisan, just reveals the ideologues within the Biden administration who have no concern for the affordability, reliability, and resilience of our most important energy network, which of course is the electric grid.
Yeah, and I'm one that believes CCS has some potential.
I don't
in the future. Now, okay, so we disagree on that a little bit, but that's okay. That's okay. The opportunities for it are pretty vast along the Gulf Coast if you can make it work. But the reality is, no one's ever been able to make it work with either a coal or a natural gas power plant in the United States, right?
Well, nothing at scale. I mean, there have been a number of pilot projects. There's a lot of talk about the potential. But remember, what you have to do to make carbon capture and sequestration work is first you have to capture the CO2 from the flue. Well, this is from the smokestack. Well, this is a very energy intensive process. You lose 20 to 30%. Well, rough estimates, a third, 30% roughly of the energy that's produced by the power plant. So if you have 1,000 megawatts, well, suddenly you're down to 700. Well, that's an enormous hit to your capital costs right off the bat.
Right off the bat.
And then assume you capture all the CO2. Okay, well, this is it's an enormous volume of stuff. Then you have to move somewhere and compress and then stuff underground somewhere. But remember, David, it's a colorless, odorless gas that's heavier than air, and it's an asphyxiant, and it's corrosive. We have so much trouble building pipelines today that are worth something. Yeah. And yet now we're saying, we're going to build pipelines to carry this colorless, odorless, worthless gas that's corrosive and an asphyxiant. And by the way, we're going to build it through your valley. And it's just the idea that this is going to happen at scale is just total. I mean, it's just crazy. There's no precedent for it. And yet this administration has said, this is a viable technology. No, it's not.
Yeah. And, and it appears to me that, and I've just been thinking a lot about this week, it really looks like the Biden administration in its final months in office, if it loses in November, is really engaged in a very heavy move to target natural gas now in recent months. We started with the pause on LNG export permitting. Then we had the new BLM rules on leasing on federal lands, making it extremely hard to obtain new leases for oil and gas exploration on BLM lands. Now the power plant rule. And then most recently, this new 1,350 page long regulation order from FERC Order 1920, which says it streamlines permitting for new transmission builds, but only if they're linked to wind and solar renewable generation, right? So, I mean, even that is an effort to target natural gas power generation and make it almost impossible to build new natural gas power plants, isn't it?
Well, and this is just the thing that is truly incredible. That what the administration is trying to do now with FERC, and let me back up for a second. So I mentioned I was in Savannah. I spoke to Tennessee Valley Public Power Association. When was it? Tuesday? No. Yes. No, Wednesday. Anyway, sometime. It was this week. I forgot where I am. But they provide power to 153 municipal utilities and co-ops in the Tennessee Valley, right? So it's some in Alabama and some in Tennessee and the surrounding states. And I spoke to one guy who was from, I think it was from Huntsville, and he said he had met with the administration officials about these rules. And he said, and including Podesta, apparently, and he said, after meeting with them, he said, my impression, this is something he told me directly, was that they want to push through as much of this regulation as they can because they don't know if they're going to stay in office, and they're just going to see what they can make stick. Yeah. And I thought, man, how cynical. And especially
because way to run a government, right?
Well, but also just that they feel like, we're just going to try and effectively make this regulatory end run by the administrative state on trying to decarbonize the utility sector in a haphazard manner, with no accountability. Remember, there are no legislators that are voting on this. This is all the administrative state. And the same thing is true with the EV mandates. But yes, I think it's just this FERC rule 1920. It's super complicated. As you say, it's 1,300 pages. I did the word count, 352,000 words. I mean, it's just, who can possibly understand this? And so, we can talk about that. It's just regulation by strangulation is one of the things that I just came up with.
Yeah. Now, Robert, with all these new demands on the grid, it all seems so, you use the word cynical, and I think that's right. It's extremely cynical because so much of this not only isn't likely to work, it can't work, right? Just due to physics and thermodynamics and, just the reality of our situation now. And there's
land use conflicts. So even if you have the rule that the FERC says, we'll go build all this transmission, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to get the rights of way. And remember, and I've been tracking the land use conflicts around wind and solar for 15 years. There have been we're approaching 700 rejections or restrictions of wind or solar in the United States since 2015. So, we're just going to favor these. Well, okay, where are you going to put it? It's not just that it's intermittent. It's not just these problems with, we're making our most important network dependent on the weather when we should be making it weather resilient. It's the fundamental problem of where are you going to put all this junk? And I use that word. It's the right word. Where are you going to put all this junk, and how are you going to source it? So it's very myopic, the whole thing. We have to understand, in my view, climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern.
Yeah. But don't you think this FERC rule, the goal of that is to force the states, because it puts the burden now on the grid managers and the power generators and state governments. They have to come up with these plans for how they're going to, design their grids and structure their grids to comply with all these, climate alarm generated emissions demands, goals by 2032 or whatever it is. So the burden's now going to be on the states. And don't you think that their view is that what's going to happen is, because the burden is on the states and the grid managers and power generators are going to be facing new penalties coming from the federal government if they don't comply, that the state governments, and California is already essentially doing this, and a couple of other states, will move to deny local communities the rights to reject these renewable energy industrial sites, right?
Well, we've already seen that, and that's a really, really important point that we've seen since I think about 2021. Now you have 4 heavily Democratic states, democratically controlled states: Michigan, Illinois, New York, and California, have all passed measures that allow the bureaucrats in their state capitals to Bigfoot local communities and force them to take wind and solar projects they don't want. So, how do I look at the politics in general, and where, it's always follow the money, who benefits, cui bono, right? This is how do you analyze the problem? Well, who gets hurt and who profits? Well, so why are these legislators doing this? Well, it's because there's money involved, and not just a little money, it's massive amounts of money. And it's the NGO industrial corporate climate complex. What I see, and I think it's there's nothing that I've seen in my reporting on this now for the last 15 years that changes my mind on any of it. What we're seeing is a war on rural America that is being fought for the profits of big banks, big business, big law firms, and the big NGOs. They want to build all this stuff out in rural America, and they don't care about rural America because rural America is predominantly Republican. They're a bunch of troglodyte Trump voters out there anyway. Screw them. We're going to force them to take projects they don't want because of climate change. That's the rationale. Okay, that's the rationale. But I don't think any of this has anything to do with climate change. It has everything to do with money. And it's just that simple. It's about who wins, who makes the money. And so you see, companies like Shell or Invenergy or NextEra or Mid-American Energy suing local communities across America. And in the case of NextEra, actually suing an individual, a woman in Canada, to try to shut them up and or force them to take projects they don't want. I mean, if the oil and gas industry did this, it would be front page news in the New York Times. But because it's wind and solar, no coverage.
Yeah, that's right. And, it'd be one thing. And I think you're right about absolutely all of that. I don't have any argument at all. I think that this is I don't think it. I know it. It's the biggest transfer of wealth scheme in human history. It really is. I mean, we're spending not just billions of dollars, but trillions and trillions of dollars. We had this study from Bloomberg. I guess it was Monday or Tuesday of this week. They published this study raising their projection now because of the advent of AI and all the power demands of the total cost of the energy transition through 2050 from $180-something trillion to $214 trillion.
Wow.
And my reaction to this is that, we have places like Bloomberg, they do these studies, and Wood Mackenzie came out with a similar one a few days earlier. And they talk in trillions of dollars like we used to talk about billions of dollars just 10 or 12 years ago.
Right.
I mean, this is a total step change in what we're talking. And these numbers are so enormous that the human mind can't even grasp it, much less have any understanding of how the government issuing that much debt, because it's all funded by debt in
Right.
this country, to fund this energy transition that can't work because of things like physics. They're kind of pesky. They're actual laws. Um, just over 27 years, and the average human being cannot even begin to imagine the impact that's going to have on their lives in terms of inflation, devaluation of the currency, the lowering of their standard of living. Um, and so they get away with it because people cannot possibly comprehend it. And no one in the news media, of course, is interested in reporting about it.
Well, and you make a key point here, which is I'm long America, right? I'm bullish on the
Well, me
United
too.
States for a
Yeah.
whole. What did I met with a guy when I was in Savannah who was a former Marine guy, Marine Corps guy, and real clean cut, works at Pike Electric. I've got his name here somewhere, but we talked about this very issue about the United States and its existing advantages over the rest of the world. So they're obvious, right? Demographics, geography, the rule of law, relatively young population, no enemies at or near our borders except for those dangerous Canadians. And he said, and I said, I'm still long the U.S. and we still have a lot of advantages on the energy front, even though there are all these other challenges. And he said something, it was interesting. He said, yeah, we still have a lot of strategic margin. And I thought that was a really interesting phrase I'd not heard before. But to go to your point, David, I think the key issue for me is what concerns me about the United States over the long term, despite, I'm going to acknowledge my bullishness, and I'm incredibly bullish, but it's the class issue. So I don't see the divide in America as being left versus right. It's top versus bottom. And all of this decarbonization policy, all of the climate policy, despite all this rhetoric around climate justice and environmental justice and blah, 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 that we hear about endlessly, all of this climate policy screws the poor and the middle class. All of it.
All of it.
All of it. There are no Teslas. There are no EVs in the hood. There are no EVs in the barrio. Low-income people are just trying to, pay for their gasoline and pay their bills. They don't, even if they could afford an EV, they likely don't have electrical service in their home if they own their home to recharge it. Who buys rooftop solar? Who buys Generacs? Who buys electric vehicles? It's on average for all of those customers, all of those potential buyers, all of them have household incomes at least 2 times the national average. I know this. I mean, I'm putting in a Generac in my house. What's the average household income for a Generac buyer? $145,000. So these blackouts, these cost increases, the electric vehicles, the solar rooftop mandates or subsidies in California, their mandates, all of this is regressive for the poor and the middle class, every bit of it. And that is the part that I just find absolutely loathsome.
Well, it is. And unfortunately, though, people
You got me all going already here.
No.
I've only had 2 cups of coffee and I'm already just on a rant.
This is how I live, man. I live this way every day.
Welcome to your house.
Yeah, welcome to my world. No, I get up and I think about this every day because, but they're able to get away with it because we've done such a horrible job of educating people. People don't understand why their utility bills are 30% higher today than they were in 2021. They don't understand why the price of a new car is 50% higher today than it was 5 years ago. They don't understand why this is happening to them. And so we end up with elections in which they keep voting for the people who are doing this all to them. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and so it's so frustrating, but we're seeing, I think, and I wonder about your views on this. I mean, to me, I think we're seeing the tide begin to shift, particularly in Europe. We see European governments now backing away from these insane emissions goals they had set, net zero by 2035, all EVs by 2030, right. All these crazy things.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see a retrenchment in all of that. That, of course, hasn't happened to the Biden administration yet, but I think would be inevitable if he gets elected to a second term, because none of this is going to work.
That's interesting because my sense is that you're right, that the tide has turned. I mean, I think we clearly see this in Europe, right, with recent elections, with conservatives sweeping into power.
Yeah.
You also see, I mean, you've written many articles about the fact that electric vehicle sales in Europe are plummeting. Are they right? That this idea, the public is just going to adopt these technologies because we have mandated them or we're encouraging them. That's not the case. But I think the more broadly, the proof is in the pudding. You see where the deindustrialization of Europe is underway, and Germany's economy is in recession. Chemical makers, steel makers, aluminum smelters all across Europe, because of high energy prices, are closing down or being temporarily shuttered. And this will continue because they have, the Germans in particular. And if I were a better person, David, maybe a better Christian, I'd feel sorry for them. I don't.
Yeah, I don't. I
You
don't.
drove
I can't make myself do it.
You drove yourself into the ditch. I hope you like it there, because this is you made your bed. Now you're going to have to sleep in it. You hitched your wagon to Russian gas, and this insane idea that you could run your economy solely on wind and solar and hopium, and it didn't work out. And now what's happening? Well, you don't have enough gas, and the gas that you do have is expensive, and the same with your electricity. So, if policymakers were serious, if that's the big point, the big question here, if they were serious, they'd be looking to Europe to say, well, we shouldn't do that. But I'll mention one other thing because I want to get your take on Europe as well. And, I'm not doing my podcast anymore, but I want to interview you about how you see it. Why is this administration, why are the Democrats so heavily tied into the climate issue? I think it's just about fundraising. I think it's just that simple.
Sure.
They know how much money they can raise through the League of Conservation Voters, through the big NGOs like Climate Works Foundation and their backers, and the billionaire class, the Silicon Valley crowd. They care about climate. Whether the rest of the public does or not doesn't matter to them, because for the Biden administration and for John Podesta and the people who are running the White House right now, they're looking to the election and saying, we have to cater to this particular class, and it is a class, because they can help us fund our reelection effort.
Sure. Yeah, that's a big driver of that's what the pause in LNG permitting is all about. It's why they put it on a timeline to where the pause presumably ends after the election is over.
Right.
It's
and Granholm has essentially said this, right?
Yes.
Oh, we'll just wait. It's going to work. Don't worry about it. We're going to, and fully admitting, in fact, that this is just a wholly partisan, wholly transparent political move. And we'll resolve this after the election, because that way they can give throw a little breadcrumb to Bill McKibben and 350.org and the Sierra Club and the rest of them, and then that'll be enough.
Right. And those, so that one doesn't bother me so much, although it's still incredibly damaging, just in terms of confidence with our trading partners that the U.S. is a reliable supplier long term. But what really does bother me though is when we get these. I think you said combined the EPA regulations and FERC Order 1920 combined are over 1 million words, right?
Yeah.
You get these regulations and they are hard, really, really hard to repeal unless the courts rule that they have to be either modified or repeal. And that's always a crapshoot. So that part of it is, not just done to placate their funders in the party, which the environmental movement is a huge funder of it. Right. But it's also a permanent thing unless you can get the courts to rule the right way. The only way you get rid of regulations like that, absent the courts, is through repeal by Congress. And we see, Congress can't even agree on what day it is most weeks. So,
right. And that's a key point, because from, my understanding, and basing this on people with whom I've talked to and are knowledgeable on this, is that the Biden administration wants to push through as many of these measures as they can, and do it now, because it will allow them to get these rules in place, and then they can't be reviewed under the Congressional Review Act.
Right. Which they're already running up against that deadline as of this week, I think.
Right. So. And the clock is running on that. But then the other part, though, that's key for the utilities, and I speak to a lot of cooperatives, a lot of public power. I love these people. I mean, they're the people who make America work, and they're in Naperville, and they're in Breeze, Illinois, and Von Orr, Tennessee. I met these people, and they're all humble and hardworking, and they are members of their community in rural America, and they're making their local utilities work, and they're just competent. But one of the points that I made when I was in Springfield a couple of weeks ago, I told them, I said, your competence is not enough anymore. You may be competent, but that's not enough now, given the political situation in America. You have to fight for your business, because otherwise you're going to be run out of business.
Right.
But I think that this is the part that is so, fits in with this political realm that we've been talking about, is that, that middle America, flyover country, again, the Democrats generally just don't care about it, because they get their votes on the coasts and in the big cities. And so, yes, it's a class issue, but it's also an urban-rural divide issue. And all of this, I think, is just, it's not being reported in any kind of fair way by the big media outlets, because they're part of this disassociated elite that don't know anybody who's a welder or a farmer or grew up on a farm, or, they have no relation to those people. Right. And so they just don't care.
Yeah, that was one of the great things the Trump administration did early on, was to at least try to move the headquarters of the Bureau of Land Management out of Washington, D.C. and out to Denver, and to be closer to all those offices in those Rocky Mountain states where most of the BLM lands lie. That was a great idea, because you get the regulators closer to the people who are actually being regulated and impacted. Right. And these people in Washington, most of them have never been into flyover country, so many of them, in any real way, and don't understand the difference between rural America and big city America. And it creates a complete lack of understanding within the ruling class. They live in their little bubble. They go to all their little dinner parties at night, or to the bars there in Washington. And there's a lot of really good bars in Washington, I know from experience. But they don't ever get back here to Texas and to Nebraska and South Dakota and, all these states that are really being impacted by all the crazy stuff they're doing. And they don't see it in real time or experience it in any real way in their own lives.
And well, let me go back, if I could, because this was I went on my rant about or my diatribe.
Well, we love diatribes here. That I used to actually write a column called the Daily Diatribe. So, yeah.
So if you look at, I did the numbers, and I'm going to write about this, and you can't steal this idea because I'm going to write about it, but you can use it afterward. But this idea of regulation by strangulation. So we mentioned FERC Order 1920, which now came out 10 or 12 days ago. It's 1,363 pages. It's 352,000 words. Okay, so that's just in the last few days. Then we go back to May 9th, where the EPA publishes its emissions rule for power plants in the Federal Register. It's 267 pages in the Federal Register. But then I took that, I copied that and put it into a Word document. It was 700 pages and 300,000 words. Yeah. Then you go back to April 18th, when the EPA published its tailpipe rule on vehicles that will require automakers by 2032 or so be selling 60% roughly of the vehicles are either all EV or hybrids. It was 374 pages in the Federal Register. It's 1,200 pages in Word, 371,000 words. So in the span of a month, roughly, where today's the 23rd, since April 18th, the Biden administration has published far-reaching regulations that will directly impact two of our biggest sectors, the electric sector and the automotive sector. And in total, the regulations encompass over 1 million words of text. Who can possibly figure this out?
Nobody can.
It's just the complexity of that is, these are the lawyer lobbyist full employment acts. Who's going to be able to navigate this? So but again, I think I look at this and I think, it just is another example of this schism in America, this split in America between the elite and what Joel Kotkin calls the clerisy, right? The regulators, the policymakers, the people who are within these rich NGOs, the Sierra Clubbers, NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, Climate Imperative, Climate Works, all of which are spending billions of dollars per year. They have no connection to the actual people that make the electric grid work. They have no concern about the scale of these regulations because it doesn't affect them. And in fact, they're cheering it on.
Yeah, and so were some of the politicians. You know, Chuck Schumer really urged the FERC to move in
Yeah,
that direction because he knew he couldn't get any kind of permitting reform that discriminates in favor of renewables through Congress,
right.
which is where acts like this should be taking place. And I
Of
know
course.
1920 will be challenged in court, and people say, well, they're going to challenge it in court, and the courts might reverse it. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is if you're in that sector that's being regulated, subject to that regulation, the big deal is you've got to have people on staff trying to figure all this out and how to comply with it in case the courts don't rule the way the courts should rule in this case,
Right. Right.
which happens all the time in America, by the way. And so it's a big deal from an economic perspective and a capital allocation perspective and a planning perspective. It could set an entity like the Tennessee Valley Authority back half a decade in its planning processes.
Yeah.
Just having the contingency of having to comply with this level of complexity in a new regulation handed down by these five, dictators in robes at the FERC,
Right.
for lack of a better way to describe them. I mean, it's just such an extraordinary grab of power, and it leads me to my final question. I wonder if you agree with something I've been saying for several years now, that we have the very worst class of individuals in our society possible making all of these decisions for us, which is politicians and regulators. And I wonder if you agree with that. I mean, I think you would get better decisions with the first 100 names out of a phone book if phone books still exist.
Yeah. Who was that that said
that? Was William F. Buckley. Yeah.
William F. Buckley. Yeah. The first 100 names in the Boston phone book, right?
Right.
Then, yeah. Well, worst, I don't, I don't know about worse, David. I look at politicians and I think, okay, I would never do that, but God bless you for doing it, right? Because someone has to take that job, right? Someone has to do that. So I alternate between, lately I've had these two competing ideas in my head. One is that I'm just more cynical than ever. I mean, I am. I'm just, I look at the world and I think, man, are we ever in a fix here? And then there are other moments where, like I was in Springfield, Illinois, watching this award ceremony, and they were giving awards to the local, the people who'd been at the utility in Naperville and in Springfield and Breeze and so on, and recognizing them. And these people were getting up and they were bashful. They were so humble. They were just doing their jobs, right? They were competent, and that was enough for them. And they didn't need to be recognized. And that was one of those moments where I'm like, God, this is a great country. So I have these two competing ideas that are, I'm not going to say they're at war, but I'm holding them both in my head now because I go back and forth between the cynicism and the hopefulness all the time. And I am hopeful for the future. But our political class right now is not representing the working class in the way that it should. And that concerns me more than anything.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also respect politicians. Anybody who makes the sacrifices they make, any well-intentioned individual to run for office has to make so many sacrifices to their family life and their personal lives. To do that, you have to respect that.
Yeah.
The fact matter is, you can go through the halls of Congress and meet with every member of the House and the Senate, and you wouldn't find 5 people with any real knowledge about what it is they're making all these decisions about. And it's so disturbing to me that, and of course it's their staff who tell them what to do and analyze everything. And some of their staff actually know it, but the motivations of an office holder, particularly a member of the House of Representatives who has to run for re-election every 2 years, are so oriented towards, well, how do I make a decision that helps me get elected next time?
Yeah.
That's a terrible motivation for making decisions about these issues that, as you say, impact mainly the middle class and lower class far more than they impact the wealthy classes in this country.
Right.
And it's a terrible situation. I realize we don't have any real alternative to, if you're going to take this authoritarian command and control regulatory approach to this energy transition, which is what this administration has done. You don't really have a choice. These are the people who do make decisions like that. But it's really a bad situation for our society at large to have people who don't know anything about the subject matter, anything real, being the final decision makers. And, I think you can carry that into some of Biden's cabinet appointments, who I won't name, but you all know who I'm talking about, who don't know anything about anything, but sit there and make all these decisions. So anyway, that's why I feel that way. But to all the politicians, particularly in Texas, who know me and I know you, you have my full respect for all the sacrifices you made and my gratitude for doing it, because I damn sure wouldn't ever do it. So
yeah, no, I know, and I wouldn't have the patience for it either. I mean, just because of the, the problem is just so I don't know. It just the nature of the game, I think, is it's too slow. And I enjoy my autonomy, and I'm incredibly fortunate in my career. I'm able to do what I do. It's my purpose and my passion. I work hard, and there's no question I work hard, but I also feel incredibly fortunate to be able to be involved in the discussion. And so, yeah, I'm as to quote the great Lily Tomlin, I'm so no matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up. But but at the same time, there's a lot of reason for hope, and I think that I live in Austin, Texas, and my trash still gets picked up, and the supermarket is amazing. I go into the supermarket, and I'm just like, this is just incredible that we have all this stuff here, and it's so relatively cheap, and the variety and the quality is just out of sight how good it is. We're just I have to start with gratitude, and that keeps me sane, and just barely, but it keeps me sane.
Listen, we've had a couple of comments here before we wrap up. You said it, Mr. Bryce, it's regulation by strangulation. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. DOE, DI on a rampage. Yes, they are. And let's see here. You guys are correct. It's become evident our government of the swamp people is no longer for the people. Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways that's true. But that my experience, and I was a lobbyist, for 20 years. My experience is, despite their lack of knowledge on these subjects, most of the people, particularly in Texas, I mean, the Texas legislature, 8 out of 10 of them are there because they want to do the right thing, do good for their community. Right. Okay, and that's really their main motivator. And in Congress, it's, a lower percentage than that, but still, you've got an awful lot of really good intentioned people trying to do the right thing for the country. So, we shouldn't try to put them all in one barrel. And even in, I'm so critical of the Biden administration. A lot of those people in the Biden administration, those appointees, are really well-intentioned people trying to do what they believe is the right thing. Okay. They, even if they're folks who are caught up in the global religion of climate alarm, they still honestly believe they're doing the right thing. And so people can disagree in good faith, but yeah, there's an awful lot of bad actors too. I don't know what.
And I think that, well, I mean, I had this comment about it's a government of the swamp people and no longer for the people. What I think I would restate that, or I'd just maybe add, I'd say, well, the who has the gold rules, and what we're seeing here again, I'll go back to the class issue, because I think that that's the nut of it. It's just fundamentally about class, and we have to keep that in the forefront here, because that's the reality. And and if you look at it from a practical politics standpoint, well, yeah, duh. I mean, okay, well, tell me something new. This is the way politics works. It's who gives the money to the politicians. It's the people who want something out of government. And one of the great political speeches I ever heard of was a guy named Danny Roy Young here in Austin. He was a restaurateur. He's dead now. He used to play the washboard with Cornell Hurd at Jovita's restaurant. It was a restaurant that was later shut down because it was actually a front for a Mexican heroin ring. But I digress. But the enchiladas were good. So Danny Roy Young was a restaurateur, and he was talking before the Austin City Council. This is years ago, and he, there was some project, some construction, some city project that was going on. It was right in front of his restaurant, and he goes on and says, "Well, it's a problem for this, that, and the other," and and then he concludes and he says, "Look. here's the bottom line. He said, I don't want you to do anything for me. Just don't do anything to me. And
Yeah.
and
that's how most people live, right? I mean,
that's the nut of it. And now we are facing, and this is the point that I made in Springfield. This is a point I made in Savannah earlier this week. And I told these people who run these utilities, your competence is no longer enough. Yeah. Because government now doesn't want to leave you alone. They want to dictate to you what you're allowed to do. And that's a step change in that, more so than what we've seen, I think, in my lifetime with this administration, with the automobile rule, with the, the greenhouse gas rule, with the stove, gas bans, these other things. That is a very dangerous set of precedents that we're facing here. And it concerns me greatly.
So what do you got going on next? You told me the other day you have 34 different public speaking engagements on your calendar?
Yes, I have 35 engagements on my calendar. Where am I going next? I'm going to South Carolina. I'm talking to the electric cooperatives of South Carolina near Charleston, not next week after that. And then, I'm my dad's card is getting full. But, again, how fortunate is this that I can do this? And, yes, I get paid and I'm good at what I do. I mean, I do a lot of public speaking. I've done 500 or more engagements. But I get to meet people and I get to understand their businesses. And, I was in Savannah. I met the head of the Fort Loudon Electric Cooperative in Von Orr, Tennessee. And he was a lovely guy. And we talked for a long time. And he was raised on a ranch. He served in the Marines. And, he's competent. And, he introduced me to his daughter. And he's the chair, the chairman of the board of directors now, the TVPPA. And just a lovely guy. And, what a privilege that is to be able to meet these kinds of people and hear about what they're doing.
Yeah. And the great thing about this country is there are 50 million Americans just like him.
Yeah.
Right. Just really good people doing the right thing, working hard, trying to scratch out a living and have the government leave us alone. Anyway.
Don't do anything for me. Just don't do anything to me.
Don't do anything. I got to remember. I may steal that at some point.
You are welcome to it. Danny Roy Young.
Robert, we better wrap this up, man. I really appreciate it. It's always so much fun to talk to you. And I admire your energy for this, and just can't wait to read your next contribution at Substack.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. Glad to be on.
All right. Take care. And thanks to our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel, Sandstone Group, for hosting our podcast. That's all for now.